Good morning, Professor James Brancheau. Due to the current condition, I was unable to attend school today, and so this is my effort to be able to get the 10% for completing my midterm for the class of Introduction to Western Literature. So today, I'm going to start by presenting about The Mass of the Red Dead by Edgar Allan Poe, and this was my analysis towards the writings and the short story that was written by the famous Edgar Allan Poe. So, as I was looking for poems or short story to be accomplished during this class, and I found out that I wanted to do something relevant. Stories about the pandemics have over the history of Western literature, such as it is offered much in the ways of processing strong emotion and political commentary on how human beings respond to public health crisis. Literature has a vital role to play in framing our responses of the COVID-19 pandemic. Storytelling functions as a method of discussing social structures and interaction during the earliest days of the Renaissance. So, The Mass of the Red Dead was one of those short stories written by Edgar Allan Poe. He was an American writer. This was published at the United States on May 1942. The publisher was Graham's Magazine, a 19th century periodical based in Philadelphia. Trivia: Edgar Allan Poe was actually one of the writer and editor in Graham's Magazine. It was published in the English language. So this was during around the end of World War II. So I want to do something relevant to the current issue right now with this coronavirus or COVID-19, which I also am struggling during this pandemic or this crisis, and all we have to do is doing quarantine. So this story is a good reflection of this situation right now. The Mass of the Red Dead. Let me tell you the story of The Mass of the Red Dead. It's a very short story, so I'm going to make it as visualizing and as entertaining as possible. Red Death is a terrible plague with gruesome symptoms that has swept over the land. Victims are overcome by sharp pains, sudden dizziness, and profuse bleeding at the pores, and die within half an hour. This is kind of similar to what we have with the coronavirus, right? There was one prince called Prince Prosperous. People were half depopulated, meaning a lot of people died, currently like what we have right now. He summoned to his presence 1,000 of his friends from among the knights and the dames of his crown, at the deep circulation of one of his castle at ease. A strong and lofty wall girdled it. This wall had gates of iron, and bolts of the gates welded there were pleasure, buffoons, ballet dancer, musicians, beauty, and wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death, or the plague. Towards the close of the 6th month of his circulation, or what we know in quarantine, the prince entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball. Of the most unusual magnificence, it was his own guiding taste which has had given characteristic to the masquerades, which we will talk about later on. The mass was held in an imperial suite consisting of 7 rooms. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. The first chamber was blue. The second chamber was purple. The third chamber was green. The fourth chamber was orange. The fifth chamber was white. The sixth chamber was violet. But the last room, the 7th room, is decorated in black and is illuminated by a scarlet light, which is a deep blood color, cast from its stained a glass window. Unlike the other rooms, there were no guests there. Stood a gigantic ebony clock, whose pendulum swung every hour of the day. Since it was that dark, all the guests, the 6 rooms was filled with people. But the last room wasn't, since it was very dark, there were nobody there, and this creepy big clock there. So just as midnight strike at 12, the pendulum chimes 3 times. 1, 2, 3. The last echo of the last chime. Everyone, musicians paused, waltzers stopped their dance, and the people grew pale. What happened was, the crowd became aware of the presence of a masked figure in a dark, blood-splattered robe, resembling a funeral shroud. The figure mask resembles the rigid face of a corpse and exhibits the traits of the Red Death, full of alley, of terror, horror, and of disgust. With Prince Prospero being insulted seeing as a mockery, he asked to reveal the figure to be hanged on sunrise. Prince Prospero, with drawn dagger and maddened with rage, rushed after the intruder. At last, they entered the seventh and final chamber. So they went from the first, second, third, fifth, sixth, and seventh chambers. This is very important. The prince has approached within 3 or 4 feet of the figure, when the mummer suddenly turned and confronted them. When the figure turns to him, the prince let out a sharp cry and falls dead. The enraged and terrified crowd surged into the black room and forcibly removed the mask and robe, only find out the horror and there is nothing underneath. It was just robe. Only then do they realize the costume was empty and all of the guests contract and succumb to the disease, which is the red death. And this is a very important part of the story. The final line of the story sums up. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. I repeat, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. So the mass of Red Death in popular culture, as we see, they even made a board game. If you guys know Marvel's Red Skull, it was based on him, and Overwatch Reaper. So it has a lot of popular culture as well as in theaters and other popular works. But let's delve in, let's do an analysis of how this is very relevant in our situation today. Edgar Allan Poe, I read his literature during high school before. He's not a very old guy. He only lived for 40 years old. He's an American writer, poet, editor, and literature master. Best known, his tales of mystery and grim. Here, this is very important. He was one of the country's earliest practitioners of the short story. So he initially brought short story to America. Edgar may have been named after a character in William Shakespeare's King's Lear. Poe was taken into the home of John Allan, a successful merchant of goods, tombstones, and slaves. This is quite unique. He's been associated with death since he was a kid, selling tombstones. He loves mystery, crime. Had a brief time at the University of Virginia to study ancient and modern languages. He served in the military for 2 years and attained the rank of Sergeant Major for artillery. Sergeant Major was the highest rank, and as you know, as we know about his life more, the more he goes within what death is as an army, as a son of a merchant of tombstones. Even Poe wrote much of his works using themes aimed specifically at the mass market, which at that era was the Gothic era or the emo era. His death was from alcoholism, and his final words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." So he was in a depressed moment. And I guess this short backstory, showed how it shaped his literature works. So his genre was Romanticism. He was one of the father of Romanticism as well. It originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century, emphasizes on emotion and individualism as well as glorification of medieval. As you can see, the Mass of the Red Death itself was set into the medieval era. In the same time, it only shows emotion and individualism of each character. And there's only little character that we will talk about later on. It was partly a reaction to the social and political norms of the age of modernity. Here, we're going to delve more about how Romanticism shows a reaction to social and political norms that we will discuss later on. and an intense emotion as an authentic source of aesthetic experience. Edgar Allan Poe, Tales of Macabre, and his way of portraying death, as we can see, why? As it is using emotions of the reader in every room we go, right? Other authors that are actually popular: William Blake, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Victor Hugo, right? These are notable works as well. A more deeper in terms of romanticism was in Gothic fiction. That was his genre that combines fiction and horror, death, and at the times of romance. Gothic fiction tends to place emphasis on both emotion and a pleasurable kind of terror, which was portrayed by the ghost or the Red Death, which is the pandemic itself. The popular stories that we all know was like Frankenstein or A Christmas Carol. Those are very dark. It was kind of a thriller. It was a horror scene and showing how the fiction works. The style of the paper, of the short story was clear. It was the allegory. He intentionally uses symbols which combine to convey a message, a literal element of the plot. The colors of the room, for example. The symbolic counterparts, which often involve large philosophical concepts, which is life and death, in particular in the Mass of the Red Death. So let's talk about the character, right? The character is shown in the feudal system of the old Renaissance, which, if you remember, it was a pyramid showing how peasants, merchants, knights, nobles, and then kings, God, glory, gospel was all everything, right? So we met Prospero. Prospero from the word prosper, or meaning wealth, wealthy. A prosper prince. It's very literal. That's how Edgar shows. That's how Poe shows how his writing was. It was direct, right? It's a privilege, the upper class. The party guests are actually the passive characters here in the story. Is humankind itself, that I would say. I would portray them as merchants, knights, maybe those people that are very passive, because humankind nature, our nature try to escape from problem and death. We always try to run from problems. And the peasants, which was also a passive tone here, are underprivileged, lower class with no contingency and no prevention to do with the Red Death. But here we see a character that is shown very spiritual. The character wasn't shown in a human form, but it was in spirit form. Was the Red Death, meaning it shows a plague or an inevitable death. It was beyond everyone. Death is beyond everyone. That shows that no matter how high or how low you get, death will always be there. That's why the way I want to pronounce the character was in a feudal system. The setting was clear. It was in a castle abbey. It was a castle. This castle shows that it cut off from the world. In a kingdom struck by a plague, the Baltic poetry were more influential in South French. I don't think this is somewhere in America, but it was somewhere in French by the name of Prospero. It was in a castle abbey that was cut off from the world. So it was deeply secluded. This is what the short story was saying. It was deeply secluded. But Prospero and his followers have also welded the door shut. Not only you cannot come out, cannot come in. There's no interaction. So it was trying to build a wall, right? So no one can get in or even get out. Which it was something not smart to do in a pandemic. What happens is, if you try to stop yourself or quarantine yourself without getting goods or services, how could you survive, right? Let's talk about this later on with what coronavirus is having now. Everyone is inside is having a big party, but everyone outside was dying, right? So the setting is 7 rooms. This is the main theme or the main setting of what we're going to talk about. Are the rooms with different colors. That's very distinctive. Edgar Allan Poe wasn't actually trying to make people maybe paraphrase or dig deeper. No, it was there. It was direct, just as the way he writes, right? It was blue, violet, purple, and so on. This was a Minecraft map of someone making actually the rooms. So I want to focus on the number 7. The number 7 was actually the major theme I could see in this book, the number 1 major theme. The blue, purple, green, orange, white, violet, and black rooms were 7 rooms. That goes from the east to the west. The way he put it and the way people analyze is because his writings were very influential by William Shakespeare. So William Shakespeare's 7 stages of life was actually based on this. So he was telling us that the 7 rooms are the 7 stages of our lives, from birth, transition, youth, maturity, aging, wisdom, and death. These are the stages of life that begins in the east and west, meaning it's the sunrise and the sunset, right? It's trying to tell us that it's the beginning of life and the end of life. Birth to death. Something similar theme that we can tell from this was about life and death in this story, right? It tells 7 days because I believe, in my own analysis, it was 7 days God made the earth, right? And so it was the 7 days of creation. But when there was a good creation, meaning there was a process from birth to death, the 7 rooms were also a form of a very bad way or a very bad intention by the prince. So the 7 rooms not only tells about the stage, every room shows different 7 deadly sins. The green shows envy, the blue shows sloth, so on and so on. Means our life is full of sin. We are living sin. We are living as sin. We live as sin. Came to the earth as sinners, right? This is what the writer is trying to tell us. And as expected, when we talk about life and death, the major theme comes is mortality. Death is everywhere in this story. Even it's in this title, right? The description of the Red Death was applied to the closing line about death's dominion or domination. Images and symbols of death practically drip from its pages, reminding the characters and the readers that death is actually inevitable. The character in the story all try to ignore and escape death, preferring to stay focused on living life to the fullest, but mortality cannot be avoided, as they're reminded when death literally trashes their party, right? The plague, which I want to focus more as well, is actually representing the Black Death, which killed 40% of Europe. It was the bubonic death or the bubonic pandemic or the bubonic diseases, which come like a thief in the night. The Red Death is the plague itself, so it's similar. What they're trying to create is plague on that era with the Black Death, and so this literature was born. Now let's talk about key elements, right? What are the key elements that affected the story that are very important? This is a crucial, essential element. Was time. 7 days, or 7 was time. More importantly, in symbol time, was the big black creep clock is located in the black room. So it's not that hard to guess that it's meant to be a symbol of death. Timing, death is a time. Everyone has their own time, or everyone has their own death. More precisely, it's a symbol of the passing of death. Time flies, right? Time is money. Why? Because that's our life. The inevitability of death was the end of time. There was this one movie called In Time when I remember it was Justin Timberlake playing that there was a time in this wrist when the time ends, life ends. Similar to this. The trimming on the hour is a regular reminder to the revealers that their lives are drifting away with time and that death is approaching. Because in the section of the literature was when every hour the clock times or the clock sounded the the old clock and it goes like dum dum dum, all the dancers, all the singers stop only to listen to the time. This is a clear showcase of how they're actually afraid of time. Time was something to be feared. It was at the end of the room. It was in the seventh room, and no one dares to go there, right? Because it's not only a room, it was also having something that they do not like, which is time or death. The masquerade itself, the event itself, was something of a key element, right? It's a means to punish Prosper's arrogant belief that he can use his wealth to fend off the natural tragic progress of life. He's trying to hack life, he's trying to cheat life. Although he possesses the wealth to assist those in need, he turns his wealth into a mode of self-defense and decadent self-indulgence. His decadence is throwing the masquerade ball, which in a symbolistic type was an illusion of reality. It was what I said before, a humankind nature was trying to escape the idea of death. Instead of confronting mortality, they just had to ignore it. It was similar to what we have right now in coronavirus, is people always try to run from death, buying masks. They even buy a lot of alcohol and all those hand sanitizer and things. And so Prospero believed that I can cheat death, I can fight death. But in the end, we all know that was always there. It was like time, it was inevitable. So let's talk about the room that I was telling about. It was the black room, which I was saying, the seventh room. From birth to death. Black is death. Death was at the end. It was at the west. It was on the sunset. Poe crafts the last plague as the ominous endpoint. The room the guests feared was just about death. It, it's a coffin. It's black. It's a dark. It's a grave, right? So it comes to their narration and point of view. The story makes no effort to present a realistic view of any known aspects of life, the stage of life, and inevitability of death. That was the major theme that we were talking about. Edgar Allan Poe believed that you could recognize certain common features of writing that leave an emotional impact on readers. This approach is known as the unity of effect. It was also coined by him. The unity of effect was trying to tell you that all things matter into a one substance, and it's as clear as it is. The narration is to show symbols. It was there. It was not as hard as Shakespeare. It was not as hard as, I would say, even Dickens. The way Dickens and Shakespeare do was they put a lot of symbols, a lot of phrases, a lot of natural concerns or even correlations that we need to make. It was there. The narrator speaks in the third person and doesn't occupy any particular character's point of view. So it was a third person, it was omnipresent. Most of the time, he's more interested in describing the setup of the room's atmosphere that we've talked about. The colors, what it represents, how it shows life. He does take a very quick peeks into Prosperous now and then, right? And in conclusion, from what we can learn from the mass of the Red Death was no one can escape death. Human happiness, as represented by the prince, seeks to wall off the threat of death. However, since Edgar Allan Poe was a known Christian, he used biblical references. If I remember, it was 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 2 until 3. It was like Jesus was saying that the second time Jesus came, he will come like like a thief in the night. So at the end of the story, it reminds us that death comes like a thief in the night. And even those who seek peace and safety shall not escape. Death's rule has no boundary. It has conquered all. The way Jesus will come the second time, right? So let's take a glimpse of today, the current pandemic, which is coronavirus. Isn't our life like that? Isn't the rich trying to portray that I can escape death? But what happens was a lot of rich people ended up having it. I come from Indonesia, where most of the government and the rich people wanted to take advantage of the rapid tests. And it turns out, since the old people are able to, the rich people are able to afford the test, it shows that they can go anywhere and they secluded themselves out of society, right? So our tale of the coronavirus is missing this image. It is either everywhere or nowhere, depending on how privileged you are, how much your circumstances can allow you to dismiss it as fear-mongering or simply irrelevant of your life. But whether we acknowledge the mass gas at the party or not, the end of Poe's story still holds true. A society that chews for blind privilege is nothing but a party of fools, unaware that the disease is very much present, both in or out. And that is my analysis of the story. And I hope this analysis not only tells us learn about short stories or its analysis, but it reflects what we feel now, what's relevant in our perspective right now. Stay safe, stay healthy, keep indoors, but remember that this pandemic is real, right? The Red Death is inside or outside. Uh, don't try to run out of reality and try to find those fake reality. Face it and pray for the best. Thank you.